Welcome to the Columbus Publishing Lab podcast. I am super excited to have Dave Fierst with us today. So many of our Columbus Publishing Lab authors have books that I get so excited about throughout the publishing process. And so in starting this podcast, I wanted to create a space where authors had a platform to share with a wider audience what makes their books interesting, what makes them of value to readers. So the best way to follow along with this podcast in the coming weeks, in the coming months, as we have other Columbus Publishing Lab authors on the show, is to follow us on social media, especially on Facebook. And then you can also keep up with us on our website at columbuspublishinglab.com as well. Welcome, Dave. Thanks so much for being on the show today. So just to recap, Dave is the author of the book Hidden Disgrace, revealing the distress signals covered by North American Indian myths. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Emily, and thanks for having me on the show. I understand this is the maiden voyage, so I'm humbled that you would let me be the first person to do this. I'm a first-time author, as I think many of your clients are. It was a lot of fun writing the book until the end when the technical parts started catching up to me. The writing wasn't difficult. At one point, I had a friend suggest a format where in this particular case, I started with an individual and then I discuss broader topics. So that was a good suggestion. It made it easy. To me, the story really suggested itself.
Cool. And let's back up, not to interrupt you, but let's back up a little bit. And so for people who don't have any knowledge, who are watching this show for the first time and don't have any knowledge of your book or what it's about, tell the folks who are listening today what Hidden Disgrace is all about.
What I try to do with the writing is portray American Indians as human beings. It seemed in a lot of history representations, they're often portrayed as savages, unknowing, unthinking, unfeeling, or there is a tendency to go to the other extreme and consider them noble savages. And my goal was to make them appear as real people. And one of the important guides I found early on in the process, a Lakota writer named Elizabeth Cook Lynn said that what she termed anti-Indianism was the failure to put events in context. And I think in the back of my book, I have a comment about revisionist history. But what I think is a better term actually is contextualized history. For example, I read a book called Empire of the Summer Moon, and it received a lot of accolades. And I found it disturbing in the sense that the author portrayed Indians as basically demonic beings and unrepentant savages and all this. But what he didn't do was explain that the attacks by the Comanches in this particular case were done in defense of their homeland. So, of course, they displayed aggressive tactics, but there was a reason for it. And I was looking on the internet before we started about a guy named Vlad the Impaler, who was the king of Romania back in around 1400. And one of his tactics was to display the heads of his enemies on poles surrounding the territory. And it was a pretty effective tactic. And he's considered a national hero. And he's not displayed in history as a savage, although, of course, everybody who follows history knows he became what's known as Dracula. But in that context, he was considered a hero, more or less. And if you look at it, the Indian people that I wrote about in their culture, they were heroes. They were fighting off the invasion of white settlers. And that's what it was. It wasn't a noble spiritual quest. It was the whites came from Europe and conquered Indian people and killed them in vast numbers.
Yeah.
So,
I think, one thing that stood out to me as I was working with you and reading the book, you're tackling this huge subject, which is really history, right? How Native Americans have been portrayed in history. And one thing that really stood out to me was the amount of research that you did in writing this book and how you took on these books that have been out for a long time and are sort of lauded as, as the definitive reference guide for these different parts in history. And you pull no punches. You really get into those books and you point out some of these inaccuracies and some of these contextual misrepresentations that I think a lot of people don't think about and that they aren't taught. So tell me a little bit about the research that was involved as you were writing Hidden Disgrace.
Well, being a novice, but a lover of books, I initially thought I could do it by just reading books, which scholars call secondary sources. But eventually it occurred to me that to have credibility, I would need to do some original document research. And ironically enough, I was reading a book called Surviving Wounded Knee, and the author made a reference to the Lilly Library at Indiana University, which I about flipped my lid because I went to college there. And I can't say I never went to the library, but I never went to the Lilly Library, which is a repository of special documents. I believe there is a Gutenberg Bible there and things like that. And so I immediately made arrangements to go there and look at a collection regarding Wounded Knee and some related events. It's called the Walter Camp Collection, and it's online now. So people who are interested could look it up online and read some of the recording of different events. And the interesting thing in my particular case was I went over there with my sister-in-law, and I didn't really have any good recording equipment. She had a camera, and the guy who did this, Walter Camp, recorded this information on little scraps of envelopes and things like that and shoved them in these envelopes. And I thought, boy, this is not going to go well. But a professor who was very industrious made a transcript of the different scraps of paper. And I thought, boy, this would be a really good resource to have. And I asked the librarian, how do I make a copy of this? And she said, well, you have to get permission from the professor. And I said, well, how do you do that? And she went and talked to one of the supervisors, and she came back, well, this particular gentleman had passed on, so I no longer needed permission to do that. And I thought, well, it's funny how things fall into place at times. And in one instance, I went to the National Archives and I called them up a couple of days ahead of time and said, what do I do? And they said, just come out. What they didn't tell me is that the researchers who are normally there are not there on Saturdays. So I went in there and I said, well, can somebody help me anyway? And this young man goes, well, I'll go talk to my supervisor. And he came back and said, yeah, we can look. And the young man brought back some fascinating information about how the Mormons were allegedly involved in the Wounded Knee ghost dance, and how some people considered that they had stirred things up to create a crisis. So again, serendipity, I think, is a word that people like, a very serendipitous experience.
Yeah, definitely. I know, as we were working on the book throughout the publishing process, I feel like there were several moments where we had, serendipity is a good way of describing it. Just this idea that things were sort of falling into place, or, even in the proofreading process, things were jumping out at us that would be very difficult to catch. And that's always really cool. I think especially with a book like yours where it has an important message. And I think it's a parts of history and a dissection into history that needs to be delved into. You brought up the notes taken on scraps of envelopes, and one of the, I think, challenges that you face or that you've told me about was in compiling all of this research and the project sort of expanding and growing as you dug into it, keeping track of all those different pieces of research became a challenge, right?
You kids out there listen to this. If you write a book about history, make sure you keep track of all your sources, because it took me another month to sort everything out. So that was a lesson learned. So
yeah. And how will you approach that differently for your next book?
Well, that's an interesting question. I learned how to do the notation in Word, so I can just make the end notes as I go along. Of course, with my lack of technical skills and subsequent chapters after the introduction, I've just made notes inside the body of the work where I got the information. So I'm determined not to spend a month looking up sources. It felt like a waste of time in a sense, although it gave me a chance to look some things over. But I've taken your advice and not read it over, but I was just looking at the introduction today, and I thought there were some things I could have made a little clearer. I'm sure most writers feel that way, but
They do.
But in the process of actually writing the book, there were times I wish I could have spent more time editing. So yes, keeping track of sources is critical. And I have stacks of books and papers all over the place. I've been told to try to find a good place to put them. So I'm working on that now.
Yeah, and as a researcher, how, what have you learned in terms of, from the very beginning of the project, when you first got the idea to start researching and compiling this book, all the way to the end, when you were ready for publication, what did you learn along the way about researching that you wish that you'd known at the beginning?
I think more in terms of trusting my instincts on how the story would unfold. I kind of knew this to start with, and it helped me a lot. Is just when I went to a library or a repository, I acted like I didn't know what I was doing, which was a great help because I really didn't. And librarians are eminently helpful and eminently friendly, so they're more than happy to help out. I guess in terms of what I would have liked to have spent more time in a couple of places. It just, I have a full-time career, so my life really didn't lend itself to spending multiple time, weeks at a time. When I went to the Minnesota Historical Society, I spent 2 days there. I thought I could have spent at least a week, but it just didn't work out that way, and I got out of it what I could.
Yeah.
And I think full-time authors have that luxury to some extent. Of course, the flip side is I'm not depending on book sales to make a living. So in regards to marketing, I can allow it to unfold as it unfolds. And that is a luxury for me that it's nice to get some royalty checks. They've been a little bigger than I actually expected. So that's been fun. But I know the guy who wrote about Anime Akash, I wrote him an email, and I think he made a reference to his wife was a full-time lawyer, and thank God for that, because book sales can be sporadic, as you well know.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really interesting point, right? That I think it's easy for an author, really it multiple levels of the industry to look at those outliers, the folks who are, the Malcolm Gladwells, right? The people who are selling millions of books and making a ton of money, and that's their full-time job. But I think that the reality is, most authors are also, also have a day job. They also have kids, right? They got to let the dog out. They got to cook dinner.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think a lot of times authors get tripped up on this idea of, if I only had more time, if this were only the only thing that I had to do, and that would never be the only thing that you have to do. And so I think, for independent authors or for first-time authors who are balancing a career and are balancing a life, I think in a lot of ways they have the chops when it comes to discipline. I could spend a week at this historical society or library researching this subject, but I have 2 days and then I have to get back to my life. And I think that brings along with it a skill set, again, of discipline, of priority, and of, just heart, right? That you put into it in a way that I think is different than if you were doing this because you're making $1 million.
But I will say that doing this was fun to the nth degree. I learned a lot about history. I learned a lot about myself. I wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. And sometimes I just look over at the bookshelf and I think, how did I do that? And I think I just got up every day and said, my thinking was, I will do an hour every day. And usually it was a lot more, but I said I would do it an hour a day. If anybody is a fledgling writer, that's what it's just doing it. I don't consider myself an expert on Indians or a genius or anything. It's just get up and do it. And I think the purpose of writing is to tell a truth of some sort. It's not necessarily historical truth, but to tell truth. If you write a romance novel, the truth is romance is good or romance is bad. A monster book, there is good or there is bad. However, but I think, and I hope that I conveyed truth in what I wrote. And you mentioned this earlier, and I found some of the writing about Indians so one-dimensional. That really troubled me. In one book, a lady said that the American flag was a symbol of colonialism and all this kind of stuff. I said, yeah, there is that, but I've been to a few powwows, and the most prominent portion of the whole event is the American flag being taken into the center of the arena, and the Indian veterans, displaying their pride in their military service. So conflict, absolutely. And I think to be an adult, and you have to be able to entertain simultaneously conflicting thoughts that United States was an instrument of slaughter, and yet at the same time, for a variety of reasons, I found this fascinating that Indian men and women usually occupy the most hazardous roles in the military, and a high percentage of decoration for valor and that kind of, whether it's to escape poverty or other reasons, patriotism. I think that's a fascinating aspect of their culture. But to say that the American flag is only a symbol of repression, I think is cartoonish. And that's what you would see in the theaters on a Saturday afternoon back in the 50s and 60s, is this cartoonish portrayal of Indians versus the soldiers. And Indian history, to me, is fairly complicated, because you had Indians living on reservations, and yet at times they would go out and get in battles with the soldiers. So it's not like in World War II, we go fight the Germans, they're on their side, we're on our side. It was a mixture. And
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's always attracted me about your book and about your research and about even the tone and the voice that come through in your book is that, you know, like you said, you're not an expert on this as a whole, but I think why Hidden Disgrace is so valuable is because it points out that complexity, you know, and it really at its core says, you know, to gloss over or to create a perception of these events, of these people that is stereotypical, that is not complex, is doing a disservice. It's doing a disservice to Native American people. It's doing a disservice to history. And yeah, I think that's really important. Cool. So we should have got into this at the beginning, and I meant to ask you, but that's okay. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I hope I can distill this down into a simple answer, but what struck me about going out to Pine Ridge was the pervasive poverty that I saw the first time I went through there. Now, it wasn't the first time I'd seen poverty on that scale. When I was in the service, I went to Panama, and the poverty was just stifling. And one of the local people I talked to said, we've got one of the best economies in Central America. And I thought, how is this even possible? But at that time in my life, I was focused on being a good soldier and had, you know, different things on my mind. When I went through Pine Ridge, I'd lived a lot longer, and I think the thing that stood out is the Wounded Knee massacre really happened. And that may sound odd, but I said, this is not something in a movie. There's a big hill with the burial ground on top. I said, wow, those people were really killed there in about an hour's time. And the estimates of how many people were killed range from 150 to 300. I think the more accurate figure is the higher figure, 300 plus. Wow. But for some reason, I was determined to do something about it. I'm sure I'm not the first person to have that impulse, but I thought about, well, I could do some fundraising for Wounded Knee people and Pine Ridge people and all these kind of things. And it just really didn't pan out. But I did get a hold of a volunteer organization, and I went out there for, it was 4 days, 5 days. And at the end of the week, there was a group of people. We were all sitting around the day room, and I suppose I was the elder statesman, but the moderator of the discussion said that John Wayne said the two most important days of your life are the day you were born and the day you figure out why you were born. And this thought just struck me that when it came to my turn to say, what did you think about the week? I said, I'm supposed to write a book about this place.
Wow.
And I just started reading, and the book does contain other discussions of Indian nations, but it's primarily about the Pine Ridge Reservation and what I considered the two significant events there, the Wounded Knee Massacre, and then they called it the occupation, which occurred when I was in high school. And you know, it's a funny thing. Russell Means, one of the American Indian movement leaders, said that your thoughts are prayers. And I remember in high school having this thought in these exact words when I found out they went out to occupy Wounded Knee. I wish there was something I could do to help those guys. Now, at the time, I didn't know there were Indian women involved. It was just guys, but I suppose I was being held to it, if you want to put it in those terms. But I feel pretty satisfied that I've done it. Like that's what I was supposed to do. I guess I finally figured out what I was supposed to do when I grew up.
And I think that's really impressive. You know, I think I can't tell you how many times in my life I have been in a similar situation, right? Where I've learned about something that really, makes me feel strongly. And I think I should write about this, write a blog post or write a book. I'm from Appalachia, and so I think about that all the time. But I don't do it. I think there are a lot of people out there who feel similarly, who feel that they are called to write about a particular subject, but they don't have the follow through. And you did it. You put in the work, and you wrote the book, and you made it happen, and you did it right. Do you have any advice for anyone who's out there who may be toying with the idea of doing something similar, of tackling a big subject, or putting a book together, but who hasn't done it yet? What advice could you give that person?
Well, it's like I mentioned earlier, set aside a certain amount of time every day. In my case, it starts with reading, and I usually get up and write something at the conclusion. A lot of times, for example, if you want to write about Mexican history, let's say, read books about Mexican history and get your thoughts together, and find some books on it, read an hour a day. And if you do that, I think the ideas will come. That's, I've always been a book person. I think they used to call them book nerds, and I've kind of fought that my whole life, and I kind of embraced it. I said, well, why not be a book person? And I would say to people, just make it fun. It's been a truckload of fun. I've got to meet some nice people like yourself. I'm more involved with Indiana University now than I have been. And and at one point you said, establish relationships. Don't just say, buy my book, buy my book. And I think that's been the interesting thing. And this isn't exactly in response to your question. What's been the most thrilling is people that I had no idea would be interested in my book, that I knew from the past, have shown a great deal of interest. And I find that very interesting, the people who've come out to support the project. That's really fascinating. It's not who I thought it would be. And it's been in fact, a guy from high school who I actually didn't think liked me at all was the first person to actually buy the book. And it just seems funny when people ask me to give an autographed book. I think, I'm not Stephen King, but a lot of people, it's very flattering that people would do that. I try to think of something clever to say, but it doesn't always work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I don't know. I think, one thing that's always been interesting about our relationship and working together is I think we have sort of similar personalities, which is great. I'm a person who likes to have a lot of control over a process. And I think that you and I worked really well together because we were able to balance that, right? You had put all this time and energy into writing this book. And then you had to turn it over to me and to Columbus Publishing Lab and sort of trust that we were going to do a good job with it, that we were going to do it justice. And so I think one thing that I learned from working with you is just how important that sense of control can be for an author. Because you have some authors and they want a hands-off process. You have some authors and they want to be really involved. And I think you and I balanced the two of those really well and worked well together. So I don't
think you're giving yourself enough credit, because you were very patient with me when I was not. So you deserve a lot of credit for being patient, and you're wise beyond your years.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, Dave, thank you so much for coming on and for talking about the book. I think Hidden Disgrace is a fantastic book. Again, I think it's really important, and I'm so glad that you wrote it. You can find Hidden Disgrace on Amazon in both print and ebook editions. It's also on Barnes & Noble, as well as every other major online retailer. You can also go to your local bookstore when the world opens back up and request a copy there as well. Dave, how can people stay in touch with you?
You should be able to go on my website and make contact that way. I'm on Facebook. I don't have a problem if people are interested in contacting me that way. I'm pretty out there. At least I'm not on Twitter. I think that's probably a goal I should have, but I think that the website, I do have a blog site. I haven't been that active on it lately. It's been mostly on Facebook, which has actually been an interesting way to project the book. So there was somebody that tracked me down through you, so I give them credit for doing that. I don't know if they...
And your author name on Facebook is David J. Fierst. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly? Okay, cool. And what's your website? What's your website address? Is it David Fierst?
I think it's author.
Author.com.
I guess I should know that, shouldn't I?
You should. That's okay. I'll post a link to your website in the comments so that people can follow along with you there. Well, cool. Thank you. Thank you again. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Thanks for trusting me with your book. I can't wait to work on the next one.
Well, thank you for your patience, and it really has been fun. I know I've had some moments of impatience, but in the big scheme of things, it's really been a lot of fun, and it's really fun reaching out to new people and developing those relationships. So yes, I've got bad news. I'm already 14 pages into the next book. So
I can't wait.
All right, Emily.
All right, Dave. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today to hear about Dave's book. Again, you can follow along with us on our social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on our website, columbuspublishinglab.com. In the spirit of connecting with authors, I am also doing, for a limited time, I'm also offering a free publishing consultation. No strings attached. If you are an author who is working on a manuscript, or you're thinking about working on a manuscript, or you have published books in the past, any type of questions that you have about publishing or marketing, I encourage you to reach out to me. And you can schedule a consultation by going to columbuspublishinglab.com/offer. Or you can give us a call at 740-586-0746. Thanks so much again, Dave, for being on the show, and I will look forward to that next book.
Thanks, Emily.
All right, see you.